Ryan is back. Don't worry, I'm here every Monday. As I mentioned last Monday, today we will be talking about gauges, which is the unit we use to measure the thickness of sheet metal. And if you remember from last week's episode, sheet metal is any sheet that is 3/16 or thinner. So, where does the term gauge come from? Well, it originated in the British iron wire industry, and at that time, no universal unit of thickness existed. Back then, metal sheets were created by hammering or rolling them out to the desired thickness. The term gauge referred to the number of times the metal sheet had to be passed through a rolling mill to reach a certain thickness. Each pass through the rollers would thin the metal sheet ever so slightly. The more passes, the thinner the product. So an 11 gauge sheet would have passed through the rollers 11 times. Nowadays, we also use fractions of an inch for describing sheet metal. For steel sheet metal, 7 gauge equals 3/16 and 16 gauge is 1/16. Here's a simple conversion chart to know what the inch equivalent is for each gauge. If you look closely, there are minute differences in the thicknesses of the gauge between different metals. For example, the 16 gauge aluminum is slightly thinner than 16 gauge steel, but overall, they're pretty close. Now, most of the sheet metal Schickel uses here is between 7 and 18 gauge. Since sheet metal thicknesses are sometimes hard to tell just by looking at it, we can use this tool to determine the gauge of any sheet of metal. This particular wheel has the gauges on one side and the millimeters on the other side. Easy as that. So hopefully now you have a good gauge on what a gauge is. We'll see you on Monday.